Hi, my name is Jeannie Maria Guerrero, and I'll be your host for Douglass Family Suffragists, the Sprague Sisters of Kansas City, Missouri. These remarkable women had the courage to change the world around them at a time when having courage was downright dangerous. This is the story of 3 Sprague Sisters of Kansas City, Missouri. But before we get into that, you might be wondering, who were they? It all begins with their grandparents, Frederick and Anna Murray Douglass. Frederick and Anna had 5 children. Their eldest child, Rosetta, had 7 children with her husband, Nathan Sprague. I have recently figured out when 2 of them died, Estelle and Rosabelle. Of those 7 children, 4 daughters and the only son lived into the 20th century. All 4 of those daughters lived in Kansas City, with 3 of them becoming long-term residents. The 3 Sprague sisters of Kansas City, Frederica, Hattie, and Rosabelle, each made lasting contributions to the world. However, unless you've lived in Kansas City, you've probably never heard of them. I'm hoping to change that. The Spragues lived in both Rochester, New York, and Washington, D.C. They tended to their famous grandparents when each of them passed away. After that, each sister eventually made her way to Kansas City. I believe that the sisters were drawn to Kansas City because it was an area of urgent need. Many people who are trying to escape from the Jim Crow South were trying to get to the state of Kansas, which had never taken part in the slave trade. But to get to Kansas, you most likely had to pass through the state of Missouri. Many people sailed up the Mississippi River and landed in St. Louis, and then made their way west through Kansas City, which straddles both sides of the Missouri and Kansas borders. Past Kansas City was the wild, wild west. Kansas City was a safer route to the west than points farther south, such as in Texas or Oklahoma. These 2 states were still sites of conflict between the United States and Native American nations. Texas and Oklahoma were not exactly safe passages for those with families or for women traveling alone. Unfortunately, many would-be settlers never made it all the way to Kansas. As a last-chance area of civilization, Kansas City served as an unexpected terminal stop for thousands. The living conditions of black settlers were deplorable just about everywhere, and Kansas City was no exception. Basic sanitation, food, medical care, and education were all direly needed. Following in their grandparents' footsteps, but traveling in the opposite geographical direction, the Sprague sisters settled in Missouri and provided all these services. Frederica Sprague Perry was the first to arrive. A graduate of Rochester, New York's Mechanics Institute, which is now the Rochester Institute of Technology, Frederica taught food safety and preparation at the Lincoln Institute in Jefferson City before moving to Kansas City. Moved by the health hazards posed by the lack of sanitation and medical care along Vine Street, Frederica and her husband raised the money and resources to build a larger hospital for the area. Frederica was also a member of the National Association of Colored Women, the suffrage organization founded by her mother and Harriet Tubman, another Rochester, New York connection. A former legal copyist, Frederica put together the Douglass family papers at the Anacostia estate. Those papers are now at the Library of Congress, which is where you will find the largest collection of writings and memorabilia relating to the family today. Harriet Bailey Sprague, known as Hattie, was also a teacher, specializing in grammar and English literature. A gifted singer, Hattie suffered from bouts of illness and occasional paralysis throughout her life. Hattie could have had a socialite's life in Washington, D.C. and throughout the Northeast, since the Douglass grandchildren were celebrities in their own right. Instead, Hattie dedicated herself to educating people in need. Despite her debilitating illnesses, Hattie traveled, alone, throughout the South to teach. She was among the earliest faculty members at several historically black colleges and universities in Florida, Texas, Alabama, and Maryland. Hattie taught deaf children and even worked alongside Rosamund Johnson, who composed the music to Lift Every Voice and Sing. At some point, Hattie became too ill to travel at all, and she moved in with Frederica and Rosabelle in Kansas City. Even then, she continued to work, this time for the National Association of Colored Women in their efforts to acquire and manage her grandparents' estate. Rosabelle Sprague Jones started out as, you guessed it, a teacher in Washington, D.C., and she arrived in Kansas City with her newlywed husband, a doctor who worked alongside Frederica's husband. She and her husband lived in a house along the border of a wealthy white neighborhood near Kansas City's ill-famed Troost Divide. Rosabelle faced regular challenges to her existence by a local neighborhood association, which tried to have black-owned homes torn down in the name of expanding a nearby park. The White Neighborhood Association didn't try to hide the fact that they did not want black residents in their neighborhood. Like her illustrious grandfather had done, Rosabelle's husband calmly and eloquently pleaded to save their homes. However, the same association prevented a new hospital serving black patients to be built in their neighborhood so that black doctors like Rosabelle's husband would not be drawn to the neighborhood. Rosabelle served as president of the Kansas City Federation of the National Association of Colored Women, which comprised more than 24 separate clubs. All three sisters performed vital work for the NACW during the crucial years leading up to the 19th Amendment. While white women were granted the vote, in actual practice, many non-white women were still barred from the polls. The Sprague sisters served as shining examples of the general membership of the NACW. For one, teachers formed a very large segment of the NACW's membership. It is thus no accident that education served as the NACW's highest priority. The reasoning was twofold when it came to the women's vote. One, many new voters were required to pass so-called literacy tests to be admitted to the voting booth, so knowing how to read and write were non-negotiable. 2, new voters needed to make informed decisions. This could only happen by reading up on the issues and being aware of what was happening in the world. Again, reading was key. The Sprague sisters also performed another vital area of work for the NACW, raising money to reacquire and renovate the Douglass home at Cedar Hill. Even today, the role of the NACW in ensuring the longevity of Cedar Hill is completely underplayed. Black women all over the country raised money for the Douglass home. It was one of the first ever crowdfunding efforts, you could say. The Sprague sisters performed yet a third vital area of work for the NACW, what we would call social work today. Newly arrived women and children in Kansas City and other sanctuary cities for black settlers could not provide for their most basic needs. Giving women, children, and the elderly food, clothing, medical care, and safe housing were important areas for the Sprague sisters as well as for the NACW. But I have only begun to scratch the surface of what the Sprague sisters accomplished. I hope that their story inspires you to have courage like theirs. Again, I am your host, Jeannie Maria Guerrero, and I thank you for listening to this story. To learn more, please visit my website on the Sprague sisters. Goodbye!